March 6th, 1987, a Friday evening on the North Sea coast of Belgium, and hundreds of completely ordinary people were boarding a ferry to go home after the working week. Families with children, soldiers returning from postings in West Germany, pensioners on a cheap day trip, shoppers with bags full of duty-free goods. Not one of them had any reason to believe that this crossing would be any different from the dozens they had made before. Within 90 seconds of leaving calm water, 193 of them were dead. Not because of a storm, not because of a catastrophic mechanical failure, but because one door had been left open and because an entire company had quietly built a culture in which that was always going to happen eventually. This is the story of the Herald of Free Enterprise, one of the worst peacetime maritime disasters in British history, and one of the most preventable. Before we get into it, drop a comment below and tell us what time it is and where in the world you're watching from. And if you are new here, subscribe to the channel so you never miss a story like this one. To understand what happened that evening, you need to start not with the disaster itself, but with the world that produced it. Because nothing about the Herald of Free Enterprise or the night she capsized can be understood in isolation from the industry she belonged to and the company that ran her. By the mid-1980s, the English Channel was one of the busiest maritime corridors on the planet. Millions of passengers and enormous volumes of freight crossed between Britain and the European mainland every year, and the ferry industry that had grown up to serve that demand had been shaped almost entirely by a single overriding priority: efficiency. The faster a company could get people and vehicles on and off a ship, the more crossings it could complete each day, and the more crossings it completed, the more money it made. The technology that made that efficiency possible was the roll-on roll-off ferry, known in the industry as a RORO, and by the 1980s, it had completely transformed the way the channel was crossed. The concept is straightforward enough. Instead of using cranes and lifting equipment to load cargo, which is slow and labor-intensive, you design the ship with large hinge doors at the bow and stern and a flat, open car deck running the entire length of the vessel. Vehicles drive on at one end, the doors close, the ship crosses, the doors open, and the vehicles drive off the other side. The whole car deck is one continuous, unobstructed space, with no internal walls dividing it into sections, no structural barriers between the bow and the stern, just open, flat, accessible floor. Cars, trucks, coaches, all of them roll straight on and straight off. Turnaround time at port is cut to a fraction of what it would be under the old system, and that saving in time translates directly into revenue. For the companies operating on the channel routes, this was not simply convenient. It was the commercial foundation on which the entire business sat. Shorter port times meant more sailings. More sailings meant more passengers and more freight. And in a competitive market where multiple operators were fighting for the same routes, even a slight edge in speed and reliability mattered enormously. The RORO system was treated as an engineering triumph, and by 1987, it was so deeply embedded in how channel crossings worked that most passengers had never given a second thought to how the ship they were traveling on had been designed or what made it function. The Herald of Free Enterprise was one of 3 sister ships commissioned by the British ferry company Townsend Thoresen and built at a shipyard in Bremen, West Germany, in the late 1970s. She entered service in 1980 and was assigned to the Dover to Calais and Dover to Zeebrugge routes, which were among the most heavily used crossings in Europe. She was a substantial vessel, 131 meters in length, capable of carrying more than 1,300 passengers, with space for over 400 vehicles on her car deck and enough speed to complete the Zeebrugge crossing in around 4 hours. Above the car deck, she had several floors of passenger accommodation, including a restaurant, a cafeteria, a bar, a duty-free shop, and large lounge areas with seating. She was modern, comfortable by the standards of her time, and well-regarded by the traveling public. She was, by any commercial measure, a successful ship. Townsend Thoresen was one of the dominant players in the Channel ferry market during this period, operating multiple vessels on several routes and competing directly with other major operators for passengers and freight contracts. The company had built its reputation on affordable, reliable crossings, and the culture that had developed inside the organization over the years reflected its commercial priorities with extraordinary consistency. Speed of turnaround mattered. Schedule adherence mattered. Keeping operating costs down mattered. These are not unusual concerns for a transport company, but at Townsend Thorson, they had come to matter in a way that reached into every corner of how the company was run, including areas where commercial efficiency had no business being the dominant value. The company moved fast, expected its crews to move fast, and had developed over time a way of operating in which the pressure to keep the timetable sat above almost everything else. On the evening of March 6, 1987, the Herald of Free Enterprise was completing her turnaround at the port of Zeebrugge. She had arrived from Dover earlier that day, unloaded her vehicles and passengers, and was now taking on a fresh cargo for the return crossing. Her manifest for that sailing listed 459 passengers and 80 crew members. Among those on board were British soldiers from units stationed in West Germany heading home on leave, families traveling with young children, a group of civilian day trippers who had made the crossing simply to take advantage of the cheaper alcohol and cigarettes available on the continent, and a number of individual travelers who had booked whatever crossing best fitted their schedule that evening. There were also coaches carrying groups, freight drivers whose trucks sat on the car deck below, and the kind of mixed, unremarkable assembly of people that you would find on any busy channel ferry on any Friday in the mid-1980s. The bar was open and doing reasonable trade for early evening. The duty-free shop had the usual queue of passengers stocking up on cigarettes and spirits before the crossing ended. People were claiming tables in the restaurant and cafeteria, settling children with food and drinks, reading newspapers, or simply sitting back after a long week and staring out of the windows at the lights of Zeebrugge receding behind them as the ship prepared to move. The crew were going through the familiar routines of departure. The engines were running. The ramp was being retracted. Everything about the scene was as unremarkable as it is possible to imagine. This was not a voyage anyone would remember for any reason other than getting home on time. The port of Zeebrugge sits on the North Sea coast of Belgium, roughly 12 kilometers north of the medieval city of Bruges, from which it takes its name. The word Zeebrugge translates simply as Sea Bruges, and the port had been constructed in the early 20th century to give the historic city, whose old canal network could no longer accommodate modern shipping, a direct connection to international trade routes. By the 1980s, it had grown into one of the busiest ferry terminals in northwestern Europe, handling passenger and freight traffic around the clock. The ferry terminal itself was built entirely around the logic of the roll-on, roll-off operation. At the heart of it was the loading ramp, an adjustable structure that connected the dock to the ship's bow doors and allowed vehicles to drive directly from the quayside onto the car deck without any lifting equipment. The ramp's height could be adjusted to match the level of the ship's bow, which changed depending on the tide and on how much weight the vessel was carrying. It was functional, industrial, and optimized entirely for the rapid movement of vehicles. There was one specific feature of the Zeebrugge ramp that would become quietly significant that evening. The ramp was what the industry called a high-level ramp, positioned at a higher elevation than the equivalent loading ramps at Dover. Because of this, when the Herald loaded at Zeebrugge, the front of the ship needed to be brought down in the water to align properly with the ramp and allow vehicles to drive on at the correct angle. This was achieved by flooding the ship's forward ballast tanks, pumping seawater into tanks at the bow to physically lower that end of the vessel. Once loading was complete and the ship was ready to depart, the procedure required that ballast water to be pumped back out, restoring the ship to her proper trim before she moved into open water. On the evening of March 6th, the pumping of the bow ballast was not confirmed as complete before the Herald sailed. The bow of the ship sat lower in the water than it should have as she left the harbor. In isolation, this would not have been fatal. But it was not in isolation. The central issue, the thing that caused 193 deaths, was the bow doors. On a roll-on, roll-off ferry, the bow doors are not a minor component. They are the entire forward face of the ship from the waterline upward, a massive hinge structure that opens during loading to expose the full width of the car deck, and must be closed and secured before the ship moves. When the doors are open, the car deck is directly and completely exposed to the sea. When they're properly closed and latched, they form a watertight barrier that keeps the interior sealed against the water outside. The operational safety of the entire vessel depends on those doors being shut before departure. The responsibility for closing and securing the bow doors fell to the assistant bosun, a crew member named Mark Stanley. His procedure was clear: close the doors after vehicle loading was complete, secure them, and report to his muster station. On the evening of March 6th, Mark Stanley did close the bow doors. What happened next is where the chain of failure began. Exhausted after a demanding work schedule, he returned to his cabin and fell asleep. He never made it to his muster station. He never reported the doors as secured. The officer of the watch, Terrence Sailing, whose duties included ensuring the ship was ready for sea before departure, waited for a confirmation report from below that the doors were secure. When no report came, he did not treat its absence as a reason to investigate. He assumed that if nothing had been flagged as wrong, nothing was wrong. He did not go and check. The first officer, Leslie Sable, passed through the car deck area and could see the open doors from the ramp, but he proceeded on the assumption that the assistant bosun was handling the closure and that it would be completed before departure. He said nothing and raised no concern with the bridge. Captain David Lurie on the bridge had received no report of any problem. Under the procedures in place at Townsend Thorson, the default assumption was that the ship was ready to sail unless someone specifically reported otherwise. No one reported otherwise. The captain gave the order to depart. The Herald of Free Enterprise moved away from the dock and began building speed toward the open water of the outer harbor approaches, with her bow doors standing open to the sea. There was no warning light on the bridge. This single absence requires a moment of attention. On a ship carrying over 500 people in cold water, operated by one of the largest ferry companies in Britain, there was no indicator visible to the command team showing whether the bow doors were open or closed. A crew member had previously raised this exact concern in writing to Townsend Thorson management, specifically requesting that a simple indicator light be fitted to the bridge to show the status of the bow doors. The management response had dismissed the suggestion. The crew were responsible for closing the doors, the response argued, and fitting an indicator would undermine that responsibility by encouraging complacency. The light was never installed. On March 6, 1987, the cost of that decision became irreversible. For the first few minutes after the Herald left the dock, nothing about the crossing felt unusual. The ship was moving normally through the inner harbor, and on the decks above, passengers were ordering drinks, finding their seats, and doing what people do at the start of a routine crossing. No alarm had been raised. No one on the bridge had any indication that anything was wrong. The Herald accelerated steadily as she cleared the harbor entrance and entered the outer approaches. Water began flooding onto the car deck almost immediately after the ship started moving forward. The open bow doors were now facing directly into the ship's direction of travel, and as the Herald built speed, she was effectively driving herself into the sea. The water came in slowly at first, spreading across the flat car deck surface, but the volume increased rapidly as the ship's speed increased. The car deck of a roll-on roll-off ferry has no internal subdivision. There are no watertight bulkheads, no compartments, no barriers of any kind between the front of the deck and the back. Water that enters through the bow is free to spread instantly across the entire length and width of the deck, and that is exactly what it did. Within minutes, the accumulation of water on the car deck had reached a critical mass. The ship began to list, leaning first to one side as the water settled and shifted with the ship's motion. Once a vessel of the Herald's type begins to list beyond a certain point, the physics of the situation become irreversible. The water slides further to the low side, increasing the lean, which causes more water to rush to that side, which increases the lean further in a self-reinforcing cycle that cannot be stopped once it has begun. The Herald passed that point of no return within seconds of the list becoming apparent, and the capsize that followed was not slow. It was sudden and total. The ship rolled hard to port. In the space of roughly 90 seconds from the beginning of the list to the moment she came to rest, the Herald of Free Enterprise went from a fully upright vessel carrying over 500 people to a ship lying on her side in the shallow water of the outer harbor. She settled on a sandbank approximately 1.5 miles from the port she had left minutes before, with part of her hull still above the surface. Inside the ship, The experience of those 90 seconds was catastrophic. The lights failed almost immediately as the electrical systems flooded and shut down. In complete darkness, at an angle that accelerated from slight to nearly vertical in moments, everything that was not fixed in place became a hazard. Tables, chairs, bottles, glasses, luggage, trays of food, all of it became projectile or obstacle as the ship rolled. In the passenger lounges and the restaurant, people who had been sitting moments before found themselves flung sideways and then downward as the floor turned into a wall and then into a ceiling. In the bar area, people were thrown across the space into each other and into the structure of the ship. On the car deck below, vehicles tore free of their securing chains and crashed through the dark in the rising water. The water temperature in the North Sea in early March sits at between 5 and 6 degrees Celsius. At that temperature, entering the water triggers cold water shock, an involuntary gasp reflex followed by a sudden, extreme rise in heart rate and blood pressure that places enormous strain on the cardiovascular system and can cause cardiac arrest within seconds, particularly in older passengers or those with any pre-existing conditions. For those who survived that initial shock, the cold continued working against them. The body responds to sudden immersion in water that cold by diverting blood away from the limbs and toward the vital organs, a survival mechanism that in practice means the arms and legs begin to lose function faster than the brain registers the danger. Muscle coordination deteriorates rapidly. The ability to swim, to tread water, to keep the head above the surface, all of it begins to fail within minutes of immersion. Useful physical function can be largely lost in under 15 minutes, and the total window for survival without rescue in water of that temperature is rarely longer than 30 minutes. For passengers who were trapped in flooded compartments below the waterline, the time available was even shorter. The sandbank on which the Herald came to rest was the single factor that prevented the death toll from being substantially higher. Had she capsized in deeper open water, she would have sunk completely. The shallow bottom held her partly above the surface, kept some of the ship accessible, and made rescue physically possible in a way it would not otherwise have been. The Herald capsized at approximately 6:28 in the evening, just 23 minutes after leaving the dock at Zeebrugge. The port was still visible from the wreck site. People on shore had watched the lights of the ship tilt and vanish. The distress call went out within moments of the capsize. Vessels already operating in and around the harbor moved toward the wreck almost immediately. Tugboats and pilot boats were among the first to arrive. A large dredger that had been working in the approaches repositioned itself alongside the capsized hull and quickly became the most important platform for the rescue operation, giving rescuers a stable surface from which to access the ship. Belgian Navy divers entered the water. Helicopters were scrambled from the coast. Ambulances and emergency teams began converging on the dock at Zeebrugge as the scale of what had happened became clear. The ship was lying on her port side, which meant her starboard side, normally the right-hand wall of the vessel, was now facing upward toward the sky. From the exterior, the white painted hull formed a large surface just above the waterline, and some survivors who had managed to reach the outside of the ship were visible on it, clinging to the hull plating in the cold night air. Getting inside the ship presented entirely different challenges. The interior was flooded in many sections, completely dark, and oriented at a 90-degree angle to everything passengers and crew had known about the vessel's layout. What had been corridors were now vertical shafts. Staircases had become ladders or walls. Floors were now surfaces to be climbed rather than walked on. Inside this rotated, partially submerged labyrinth, survivors were scattered through whatever pockets of air the capsize had left behind. Some survivors reached the exterior by breaking through or climbing through the starboard portholes and windows, which had previously been in the walls and were now directly above them. Crew members who had survived the initial capsize used their knowledge of the ship's layout, now completely transposed, to guide passengers toward exits. In the flooded sections below, divers worked in conditions close to the limit of what was physically possible, searching compartments by feel in the dark for people who might still be alive. One of the most documented individual acts of the rescue came from a passenger named Andrew Parker, who found himself inside a tilted corridor with a group of survivors trying to reach a passage out. The gap they needed to climb through was nearly vertical, and many of the survivors, weakened by cold and shock, had nothing to grip and no way to pull themselves up unaided. Parker braced himself in the opening, pressing his body against the ship's structure, and held that position while the other survivors used him as a step, climbing over him one by one to reach the passage above. He endured the weight of person after person stepping on him in the dark and the cold, and he was the last one to leave the corridor. Every person who had climbed over him made it out. Acts of this kind repeated themselves across the wreck in different forms throughout the rescue. Crew members organized survivors in the dark. Passengers who were physically capable supported those who were not. Rescuers from the dredger and the tugboats pulled people from the water and from the exposed hull. The medical response on the dock was rapidly overwhelmed. Survivors were arriving in states ranging from severely hypothermic to critically injured, and the triage taking place in the cold on the quayside placed enormous demands on the emergency workers present. Hospitals across the region were put on emergency alert and received patients through the night. The final confirmed death toll was 193 people. Among them were passengers from several countries, members of the crew, and children. A number of bodies were never recovered. The Herald was eventually raised and towed to a scrapyard in Taiwan, where she was broken down for metal. She no longer exists in any physical form. The 193 people who died on that crossing were not a statistic. They were individuals with families, with plans for the weekend, with lives that were ended in 90 seconds in the cold water off Belgium because of an open door and the system that allowed it. The investigation that followed the disaster moved quickly to the chain of failures that had produced it. The physical facts were not disputed. The bow doors had been open, water had entered the car deck, the ship had capsized. The inquiry's task was to establish how a sequence of events that simple had been allowed to occur on a commercially operated passenger vessel in 1987, and to identify where responsibility lay. The formal inquiry was led by Justice Barry Sheen, and the report it produced became one of the most significant documents in the history of maritime disaster investigations. It was unsparing. Justice Sheen did not confine his findings to the individuals who had been on duty the night of the capsize. He examined the management structure of Townsend Thorson as a whole, and what he found at every level was the same thing. An organization that had allowed its approach to safety to erode so thoroughly that the conditions for disaster had become embedded in how the company operated day to day. His report described the management culture using a phrase that has been quoted ever since. He said it was infected with the disease of sloppiness. This was not rhetorical excess. It was a precise characterization of an organization where the habits, assumptions, and priorities that make a safe operation possible had been quietly displaced by habits, assumptions, and priorities that serve commercial speed instead of time. The evidence that emerged during the inquiry gave that characterization considerable substance. An internal memo written by a crew member prior to the disaster had specifically requested that an indicator light be fitted to the bridge to show whether the bow doors were open or closed. The response from management had dismissed the request, arguing that the crew were already responsible for ensuring the doors were secured and that an indicator would create false confidence. That refusal, taken somewhere well above the level of the people on the Herald that night, had eliminated one of the most straightforward possible safeguards against exactly the failure that then occurred. Beyond that specific decision, the inquiry found evidence of previous near misses involving vessels leaving port with their bow doors not properly closed, including incidents connected to Townsend Thorson's own fleet. Those incidents had been recorded internally. They had not produced changes to procedure or to the design of safety systems. The warnings had been absorbed and disregarded. The criminal proceedings that followed were, in their own way, a second failure, a failure not of safety, but of accountability, and for the families of the dead, it was one they would carry for years. The director of public prosecutions brought charges of corporate manslaughter against the company, which by that point had been restructured and renamed P and O European Ferries following a corporate takeover. Individual officers and directors were also charged. The case represented one of the first serious attempts in British legal history to hold a large corporation criminally responsible for the mass deaths of its customers through organizational negligence, rather than the specific acts of identifiable individuals. The prosecution did not succeed. The reason it collapsed lay in how corporate manslaughter law was constructed in Britain at the time. A conviction required identifying a specific individual who was the directing mind of the company and who was personally guilty of gross negligence. The failures at Townsend Thorson were distributed too widely across the organization for that standard to be met. Every person who had contributed to the chain of negligence could point to others who had contributed alongside or above them. The company as a whole had been negligent in a manner that the existing law simply had no mechanism to address. The charges were dismissed. No individual was convicted. No one went to prison. The reaction among survivors and bereaved families was one of profound and lasting anger. Justice Sheen's own report had located responsibility at the highest levels of the company. The coroner's jury had returned verdicts of unlawful killing. The facts of the case were not ambiguous. Yet the legal system, as it then stood, had been unable to translate those facts into accountability. That failure entered the public conversation and remained there for the better part of 2 decades, fueled further by subsequent disasters, including the King's Cross fire in 1987 and the Paddington rail crash in 1999, each of which raised the same underlying question about how British law should respond when an organization's collective negligence kills people on a large scale. The answer came in 2007 with the passage of the Corporate Manslaughter and Corporate Homicide Act, which created a new legal framework under which organizations could be convicted of manslaughter as corporate entities, with the focus of the prosecution placed on the gross failings of senior management and how the organization was run, rather than on identifying a single individual as its directing mind. The Zeebrugge disaster is the reference point most consistently cited in discussions of why that legislation was necessary and what it was designed to address. It had taken 20 years from the night the Herald capsized to the moment the legal gap that had shielded her owners from prosecution was formally closed. The international regulatory response was faster. In the years after Zeebrugge, the International Maritime Organization undertook a comprehensive review of the safety standards applying to roll-on, roll-off passenger ferries. New requirements were introduced covering damage stability standards, meaning the engineering requirements for how well a ship must be able to resist sinking after flooding, along with improved provisions for detecting water on car decks and for responding to it more rapidly. The Estonia disaster in 1994, in which a RORO ferry capsized in the Baltic Sea and 852 people died, reinforced many of the same lessons and led to a further tightening of international standards. Roll-on, roll-off ferries operating today are regulated more rigorously and built to higher survivability standards than the herald of free enterprise was. The design tension at the heart of the RORO concept, an open, undivided car deck that can flood catastrophically through a single point of failure, has not been eliminated, but the framework around it has been substantially strengthened. For the survivors, the years after the disaster were difficult in ways that extended well beyond the physical injuries of the capsize itself. The psychological consequences of what they had experienced, the sudden darkness, the cold, the violence of a ship rolling on its side, while full of people, the loss of any sense of orientation or control, the sounds of an enclosed space in catastrophic structural distress, were severe and lasting for many of them. Post-traumatic stress disorder was not as widely recognized or as systematically treated in 1987 as it would come to be in later decades, and the support available to survivors was far less developed than what exists today. A significant number of people found themselves managing the aftermath of what they had lived through largely without adequate professional help, and many described the experience of returning to normal daily life as something that happened around them rather than to them, a sense of dislocation that persisted for years. The bereaved families carried their losses alongside the additional and compounding weight of watching the criminal proceedings fail to deliver the accountability that the facts had clearly established was warranted. Some of them campaigned for changes to the law for years after the prosecution collapsed. Some are still alive today, and for them the disaster is not a historical event. It is something they have carried every day since March 1987. The Herald of Free Enterprise was salvaged, towed to Taiwan, and scrapped in the early 1990s. There is nothing physical left of her. But the 193 people whose names are recorded as having died on that crossing have not been forgotten, and the changes their deaths made to maritime law, to corporate accountability legislation, and to the way the world thinks about what organizations owe to the people in their care are real and lasting. They died because one person fell asleep, because another person did not check, because a chain of people assumed that someone else had handled it, and because the company that employed them all had built a culture in which that kind of assumption was quietly normal and quietly deadly. The inquiry found it, the families named it, and the legal and regulatory systems that followed eventually acted on it, imperfectly and slowly, but in ways that have had concrete effects on how passenger vessels are built, operated, and held to account. The world that exists now, at least in this specific and measurable respect, is a little safer because enough people refuse to let the loss of 193 lives on a routine Friday evening ferry crossing be quietly filed away and forgotten.